You're watching FJTN, the Federal Judicial Television Network.
From the Federal Judicial Center in Washington, D.C., Confronting Crises, the employee's perspective.
It is obviously a disaster of major proportions at the works of the Murrah building.
Welcome to the program. The terrible events of September 11th were not the first time federal court staff had to confront and deal with terrorist catastrophe. 7 years ago, a bomb destroyed the Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City. The U.S. District Court was located directly across the street and suffered major damage from the impact of the explosion. Everyone in the court, judges, managers, and staff, were affected in many ways. Today you'll hear about their experiences through video interviews with 3 staff members and the chief judge at that time. The clerk of court will join our panel discussion here in the studio. As with our previous program on leading in times of crisis for court managers, apart from terrorist attacks, we will consider other kinds of crises that federal courts have faced. We'll explore how employees have reacted to these disasters, physically, emotionally, and psychologically, and how they've been challenged and changed by their experience. We'll hear how in confronting crises, many employees revealed previously unknown leadership abilities or work together in new ways to solve problems. And we'll find out what they've learned about preparing for future emergencies. When this program is over, we hope you'll take away information that can help you prepare yourself for and deal with crises that may confront you. Here's the plan for today. First, we'll review the objectives for this program. Then we'll show some video clips of interviews with District Judge David Russell, Chief Judge of the U.S. District Court for the Western District of Oklahoma at the time of the Murrah building bombing in 1995. Misty Lathan, then Judge Russell's secretary, now his administrative assistant, Stacy Nafee, then intake clerk, now appeals clerk for the court, and Debbie McGrew, then and now courtroom deputy for Magistrate Judge Gary Purcell. They will give us a vivid sense of what they experienced, how it affected them emotionally, and how they in the court reacted and responded to the unprecedented crisis they faced. We'll also have some comments from a court manager who was on our previous program, Kathleen Farrell, clerk of the U.S. Bankruptcy Court in the Southern District of New York, whose court was significantly impacted by the September 11th disaster. After these video presentations, we'll talk with Mark Maggio of the Federal Judicial Center, who will discuss how people react to crisis situations and what resources are useful to help people overcome trauma. Then a panel of managers and staff will join us to discuss their own experiences dealing with crisis and how court staff frequently emerge as leaders during emergencies. Before we move on, I want to take a moment to review a few protocols we'll use today. First, should you have difficulty viewing the program, call Convergent Media at 1-888-236-9044. And all sites, please feel free to fax in questions at any time during the broadcast. We'll get to as many as we can during our question and answer sessions. We've set aside time for both fax and push-to-talk questions, so get those questions ready. If you are at a push-to-talk site, when you do step up to the mic, please remember to identify yourself and your site. Here are the objectives of today's program. After viewing this program, we hope our audience will be able to assess their own reactions to crisis situations and learn coping strategies for the future. Describe the various stages that people typically go through in reacting to a crisis. Identify resources that can be useful in preparing for or reacting in a crisis. And describe leadership actions court staff have taken in crisis situations. Now let's turn to our video presentations. Here are first-hand accounts from Judge Russell, Misty Lathan, Stacy Nafee, and Debbie McGrew about the terrifying morning of April 19th, 1995.
The Murrah building bombing occurred at 9:02. I left at 9 o'clock that morning for a chief judge's meeting in Washington, so just missed it. I had a connection through Dallas. When I arrived in Dallas, I was met at the plane and asked to call the administrative office in Washington, which I did. I called Washington and they were expecting my call and told me I needed to get back to Oklahoma City, that the courthouse had been bombed. Of course, I was just shocked, and I really thought that it must have been a mistake. They also told me to look up at the monitor there in the Dallas-Fort Worth airport, the television monitor, and they said, you can see it, what's going on, and I looked up, and they weren't showing the courthouse, they were showing the Murrah building. But I got on the plane thinking it was the courthouse. The plane they were very accommodating. We got on a flight right back to Oklahoma City. This was probably, arrived in Dallas maybe 9:45, and probably by 10:15 I was headed back with a plane full of reporters hurrying to Oklahoma City. All of us thinking the courthouse had been bombed. In my mind, I was still thinking it's probably a gas explosion. We'd had some incidents of gas leaking in the area, and so I really thought that was probably what had happened. But soon got back to Oklahoma City and was quickly learned that it indeed had been a bomb, and that it was not the courthouse, but it was the Murrah building, which is directly across the street. I when I arrived in Oklahoma City, I went straight to downtown and was able to come to the courthouse and to the Murrah building. And it was something that it was just shocking. It's something that television can't capture. When I walked up to the Murrah building and got just, I guess, within probably 50 feet of the site, just across the street, it was just awesome. And I remember to this day the reaction I had of thinking that I've got to be dreaming. All of us have thought that before. This has got to be a dream. I'm going to wake up in the morning and it won't be real, but it was real.
When the bombing happened, I was standing in my office at the side of my desk. It threw me from where I was at my desk to the front door of our office. Of course, everybody was running down the hallways because the ceiling tiles were coming down, and of course the windows were blown out, but the ceiling tiles were coming down, and at the time we didn't know if it was our building or we didn't know where it was actually, and left the building, was starting to exit the building, got down onto the first floor, and the whole lobby of the building was just shattered. I mean, there was just glass everywhere.
Judge Purcell had a civil suit in progress in courtroom 103, which is on the first floor of the federal courthouse. And our jury was in the jury deliberation room, and the parties were in the courtroom. We had some preliminary matters to attend to before we called the jurors in. And at 9:02 a.m., a huge explosion happened, and the force was so great that it threw Judge Purcell forward. He was on the bench in his chair, and it threw him forward. And it felt like it lifted the courthouse up and, you know, it fell back into the ground. Judge Purcell's immediate reaction was that it was a bomb. We proceeded down the hallway to the front door of the courthouse. The front doors just looked like a tangled mess. All the glass was out.
We were working on a project at a desk right in the middle of the office, and not just heard a boom, I mean, you felt it. It picked you up. It went under your feet, went under your desk, chair, feet, whatever. And lights went off, ceilings come down, equipment comes through the ceilings, people are hollering. And that was the initial, first minute, first few seconds of and glass had burst everywhere. It was quite a scene.
In those chaotic moments, as people tried to evacuate the building in darkness and with some exits blocked by debris, the court's operation manager, Rick Wade, and court security officers took charge.
I mean, we had people injured, so he was, my God, he had to tend to them and get them out of here. And the CSOs, were getting people out, and as quickly as possible.
After the shock of seeing the Murrah building, Judge Russell made his way through the hundreds of people in vehicles jamming the area to the courthouse just a block away. There he met another stunning vision.
And had she not known it was the Murrah building that was bombed, you would have thought the courthouse had been bombed. All the windows on the side facing the Murrah building, most of the windows throughout the courthouse were blown out. The ceilings in the courthouse many of those were blown out. My courtroom, which was a ceremonial courtroom, the large courtroom, you could see the sky from my bench there, that portion of the roof had been blown off. So it was in terrible condition.
Meanwhile, court clerk Bob Dennis was trying to get out of the Murrah building, where he had been waiting for an elevator when the bomb went off. Debbie McGrew remembers seeing him among the crowds on the streets.
The clerk of the court, Bob Dennis, I saw him come around from the west side of the Murrah building, and his suit coat was shredded in the back, and he looked like he had been dipped in a bag of flour. And he was actually in the Murrah building when the bomb exploded. And he came out, and he was very dazed, and he was all right, and he told us to move on down to 4th Street.
Bob Dennis will join us for the panel discussion later in this program. Experts have identified several stages we all go through when we experience a crisis. Shock and disbelief is the first stage, and our interviewee spoke about this.
I particularly feel like I was somewhat calm, but I do remember everybody I spoke with said, "Are you okay? Your voice doesn't sound, you're very monotone." And I think that was shock that I just didn't realize.
That's what you did. You went home in complete and total shock, and you watched TV. And it was very strange because, you're just very numb.
Although trying to cope with his own shock and dazed disbelief in escaping the Murrah building alive, Bob Dennis had to keep going. In the late afternoon of the 19th, he met Judge Russell at the courthouse to try to protect computer equipment from the rain that had begun falling. Using flashlights on a ghostly evening, as Judge Russell described it, they went through every room in the courthouse, moving electronic equipment away from the windows and collecting women's purses and other valuables left behind in the rush to evacuate. Recalling the day, the judge spoke of how he was heartened to see what people can do in times of crisis, pointing to Dennis as a perfect example.
He didn't go home and nurse his wounds. He was back helping other people, and as I mentioned earlier, that very evening he was down helping me try to save as much as we could inside the courthouse. And then that's just one example.
The judge and Dennis then had to turn to the even harder task of deciding what to do regarding court operations and how to get information to staff.
I know the next day I issued a statement to the press advising the public, and specifically lawyers who might be filing lawsuits, that we would delay the statute of limitations, because frequently cases are filed the last day of the statute of limitations. We had a judges meeting in the living room of my house the next day to kind of make some plans for what we would be doing in the coming days. This happened on Wednesday, and I believe the courthouse reopened I'm pretty sure we reopened for business on Monday on a limited basis. But there were so many things to be done as far as employees and trying to comfort employees and keep them apprised. There's the ongoing business of the court to what to do about that. We did have we called a court-wide meeting on Saturday and invited all the employees of the court. It was at a local church nearby. We had, as I said, we had clergy, we had law enforcement, the head of the FBI was there and briefed all the employees on kind of what they knew at that point. I think that was helpful to everybody to find out. People in situations like that, they all feel that they don't have as much information as they would like, and I think that was very helpful to, and it made all of us, I think everyone felt a certain closeness in times of tragedy. You're no longer really chief judge or judge and employee, your comforter and your friend, and I think that was helpful to all of us.
Most of the staff returned to work the following Tuesday, less than a week since the bombing. In those few days, the courthouse had undergone substantial cleanup and repair. Debbie McGrew recalled the quietness and eerie calm over the city as she drove to work. It was very quiet inside the courthouse, too, as Misty Lathan remembered.
Quiet. I don't think anybody really knew what to say to each other. Because you really don't have any idea, I think, until you get the counseling, I don't think you really have any idea that these people are feeling exactly like you are. I caught myself several times at night feeling really scared. And it's almost undescribable, the terror that you feel when you turn your lights out at night. I kept thinking, this is just crazy. Why do I feel like this? You know, and I'd get a chair and I'd put it up under my doorknob thinking somebody was going to break into my house. And it was just, they were just really odd feelings. And when we came back to work and we had some psychologists on here at the building offering to do different counseling sessions, the first few counseling sessions, I think, were real quiet because nobody wanted to admit that they were scared or that they were hurting or grieving. Because I think the immediate reaction is to, what we were told, the immediate reaction is to make sure that everybody knows the government's running okay. And so I think everybody kind of talked themselves into that. Okay, we're okay, everything's fine. And then after a couple sessions of meeting with the counselors, I remember one of my coworkers finally kind of breaking the ice, standing up saying, you know, I don't know if this is weird, if I'm weird, but I remember her saying, I am so scared at night, and I lock my doors, and I recheck to make sure I've locked my doors, and I put chairs up underneath my door handles, and it was like almost all of a sudden people said, oh my gosh, I'm doing the very same thing. And I think once she broke that ice, then it was so easy for everybody to talk about their different feelings. And I think the immediate feelings, like I said, were the shock, the sadness, the disbelief, and all that. And I think it was weeks later, several weeks later, before actually the anger set in.
Stacy Nafee described how difficult it was to concentrate on work in those early days and how much it helped to have assistance from other courts. Debbie McGrew remembered a sense of detachment from work and the constant reminder of tragedy.
When we think about it now, it's just, wow, unbelievable that we came back that early and quasi-functioned, just even stood and talked and made complete sentences. I can't imagine what docketing looked like on, April 24th or 25th. It was just, thank God the other, people from the courts around the country so generously came to assist us. There were people here from the other districts in Oklahoma, people here from Kansas and from Texas to help. And, I mean, they were wonderful. They would just say, we'll answer the phones and we'll dock it for you. We'll do whatever you need to do. And, you know, so they were very helpful. And the court clerk's offices across the country, actually, they sent us letters and cookies and all kinds of stuff. And, you know, and you would go, God, I guess this is the core of life right here. You know, what people really are, not the evil people who blow up buildings and babies.
We probably knew our job so well we went through the motions. The first weeks it was very difficult because we had newspapers laid out in the lunchroom, and we would look at the obituary, and we would see the people that they had found and when the funerals were. And the first few weeks we were just deciding whose funeral we were going to. And some people went to 2 funerals a day, several funerals a week. And you wanted to go to everyone's, but it just wasn't possible.
The healing process, which is never easy, was complicated by many other factors that contributed to everyone's feelings of sadness and anxiety, as Misty Lathan and Debbie McGrew related.
Even after the Saturday after the bombing, that meeting where we had all the agencies that we had at the church, even after that, when people came back to work, I think they still felt extremely insecure. It's just the unknown of what's going to happen next, and you know, you come to work and all day long you just hear these generators going to provide all the electricity across the street, and you know there are still 100 people laying in the rubble somewhere, and some of them are people you know.
And so it was very hard because there were constantly reporters around. Of course, the cleanup effort was going on. You could look out into the courtyard from the upper floors of the federal courthouse and watch the men in their biohazard suits raking through. They would have a bobcat loader bring a scoop and dump it into the courtyard, and then they would have the men in their biohazard suits rake through it with rakes and put whatever they found in 5-gallon buckets.
In terms of trying to get back to normal, it was difficult because it was almost like there was always something there that just wouldn't quite let you. You know, you'd go for a month or two with things being a little quiet, and then you'd have to have a hearing on, of course this was before it was all transferred to Denver, but you would have to have a hearing on a change of venue. And so, you know, then security is beefed up even more. They have magnetometers on every floor of the building, and of course then the defendants and their lawyers and family members, and then the families of the victims.
Lathan, Nafee, and McGrew agree that it took a long time for many people to return to a sense of normalcy, and that the process is a very individual one. Feelings were intense for months, Nafee said.
I did, and I know we all went through the shock and anger and disbelief, and I mean, it wasn't just, you know, for a week or 2 weeks. 2 years later, if a siren went down 4th Street, we would just all, you know, why? Just lose it. So we had bad days for a long, long time.
Counseling sessions to aid staff in dealing with their emotions were helpful, our interviewee said, but they all felt that more counseling earlier would have been beneficial.
I think that things could have been better, and I don't blame anyone for that. I think it was just because we were so close to the actual event. We had so many people affected by it of every level of our courthouse. And everyone was shaken and in shock. And I believe there were a lot of people that probably needed counseling immediately. I think that everyone should have been encouraged to get counseling. It should have been made available immediately, like the second week.
I think it was so chaotic for the first 3, 4, 5 days even, trying to just get everybody's personal belongings to them and just different things. I don't think the thought of making sure the employees emotionally was okay, or emotionally were okay, I don't think was really at the forefront of a lot of people's minds. After a lot of the shock and the chaos kind of started wearing down and wearing off, I think then a lot of people in upper management realized that there were some employees that were really, well, not just some employees, mostly all employees were having really, really difficult times struggling with it.
Giving people time after they've gone through such trauma is important, Nafy and McGrew stressed.
If you can't come back 4 days later, 5 days later, you can't come back 5 days later. You know, and there were a lot of people, everybody came back. But there were a lot of us who found it very, very, very difficult. I think that, people need to be aware, management and judges, and they need to be aware that everybody is different, and certainly it takes a lot of time.
The judge I work with is very compassionate, and he always made it very clear to his staff and me that if we did not feel like being here, if we needed to leave, Judge Purcell said, you need to go home.
The experience everyone shared has drawn them closer as a court family.
I think our court family is really, really strong. I think the judges and their staffs get along wonderfully. And I think there's a sense of, I think that day, April 19th, I think kind of put everybody on the same level of ground, whether you're a judge, a file clerk, a marshal, regardless of who you are.
We don't come to work and give each other hugs and kisses every day, but there is something special. Those of us that were here and experienced this,
we're very close. We do a lot of things together, inside and outside the office. We do stuff here all the time. We have lots of fun. If there's a personal tragedy for somebody, we are the first people there to whatever you need, you tell us. We will do that.
We'll have some final thoughts from the judge and Oklahoma City staff in response to some of the questions our panelists will discuss. Let's turn to a comment from Kathleen Farrell, clerk of the U.S. Bankruptcy Court located in Lower Manhattan, just a few blocks from the site of the World Trade Center. Farrell spoke at the FJC's conference for bankruptcy clerks and chief deputies last November. Her comments reflect the need expressed by Stacy Nafy and Debbie McGrew that judges and managers be as flexible as possible in the aftermath of crisis, and that the very real goal of getting the courts up and running should be connected to the equally real human dimensions of coping with disaster.
Before we brought everybody back, there were things that we all had to consider. It was taking people longer to get to work, so we had to be a little sensitive to this, that people may not make it to work on time. It was taking me 3 hours each way to get to work, which was for at least a week, no, actually 2 weeks. But things kept improving, and things improved for the staff as well. But we were a little tolerant those first few weeks back with latenesses and people having to leave early because of travel concerns.
Shifting gears now, I'm going to turn the program over to my colleague Michael Siegel, who will discuss some of the issues we've heard about with Mark Maggio of the FJC.
Thanks, Marilyn. The comments we've heard from Oklahoma City and New York certainly raise a lot of questions. We're going to have a chance to discuss these questions and other ideas with my colleague, Dr. Mark Maggio. Mark is not only the head of our television's programs branch in the Federal Judicial Center, but also an expert in critical incident stress management. He's worked with the courts to implement CISM programs, and we're going to talk to him a little bit about that. Thanks for being here, Mark.
My pleasure, Michael. Nice to be on this side of the interview for once.
Yeah, I bet. Mark, let's say, God forbid, I've just been through a crisis myself. What am I likely to experience in terms of my feelings? Is there a sequence of feelings that I go through? The people in Oklahoma City indicated that there is some difference among people in how they react to crisis, but is there anything like a common human reaction to a crisis?
Yeah, let me start by focusing back on some of the comments from the opening tapes, because a lot of these folks were just textbook in terms of the types of things they talked about in their reactions. The shock, the disbelief, the denial. You heard it from the judge right on through. It's not just with the 9/11 incidents. That's not just with the Oklahoma City. Anytime we receive news of a traumatic nature, those tend to be some of the initial reactions people will have. It first hits our system and we're just shocked. It's like our senses are taking it in, but our mind is not really registering what it is we're hearing or what it is we're seeing. Then we don't want to believe it. No, that can't be true. We're going to make up some sort of, story in our own mind initially that you heard the judge, gas explosion.
Yeah,
okay.
I've heard people talking about 9/11, looking at it thinking it was a Hollywood prank.
Sure, looked like a special effect.
Yeah.
Again, our senses are taking it in, but the mind isn't actually registering what's happening at that point. So you heard a lot of the similar reactions. And again, whether it's a 9/11 or whether it's Oklahoma City, you're going to see those similar types of responses from people, depending on the event. There's two necessarily qualifying factors that make an event a traumatic or critical incident as we talk about them. One is just the intensity of the event, and that's obviously Oklahoma City. 9/11, pretty strong, and really for across the board, very, very strong impact for people. The other qualifying factor that is, again for me, I think as if not more important, is that issue of personal meaning of the event. We can sit, and I talked with people, I did work at the Pentagon right after 9/11 as well as New York, and we talked to some people at the Pentagon because they were hit shortly after the tower, and some of them talked about the fact they were watching on TV thinking how horrible, but again, somewhat removed until boom, that plane hit, and then all of a sudden, it's a major, it just transformed the entire incident for people. So the factors that help determine, and the reactions really have to do with the intensity and the personal meaning. And then we look at reactions in terms of cognitive, behavioral, emotional, and physical symptoms. People go through all four categories. Some people experience more of one than the other.
Interesting. There are, and they refer to also a series of categories of people who are impacted by a crisis. Some are directly impacted. Bob Dennis is literally in the building when it's bombed, and thank God manages to survive. Then there are people who, maybe we could call them survivors. Then there are people who are perhaps on a second ring, people who may have been very close to it, may have witnessed it at a very close distance, but did not get caught up in it directly. Then there's an outer ring. Is it true that there are different categories, and are there different measures appropriate for these different categories?
It's a good way. You sort of described a concentric circle configuration, which is a real good way of sort of picturing it for people. In the center, you sort of have your primary victims. We call it primary, secondary, and tertiary victims. Your primary victims, and again, the folks on the interview, certainly Bob Dennis fits that category, being right in the building when it happened. And then you have the secondary, which in most instances tend to be a lot of your rescue workers, fire, police, and EMS types, other first responders. Yeah. Here in the building, we have the people that are trained in the AED, the automatic external defibrillator. Those folks are called first responders, and they would certainly fit that sort of secondary category in the event of an incident. And then the tertiary, the third group outside, maybe on the outside looking in, so to speak, family members of the secondary and primary groups that hear, secondhand about the trauma, or share sort of vicariously. 9/11, we saw a lot about and heard a lot about people that were watching TV and were sort of glued to their TV sets, and certainly heard from them after the fact that somewhat traumatized by simply watching, and we various and sundry reasons for explaining their reaction to that. But In CISM and critical incident stress management, I want to emphasize too that we tend to go in and initially try and identify those target groups and then try and tailor and determine an appropriate intervention depending on who the individual is, the level of reaction, going back to your first question, that people are demonstrating. I always ask what kind of behaviors are people showing, prior to determining what intervention might be appropriate, and then from there determining how many people, what types of CISM teams we would need to bring together. Very similar to what we did in our response to New York Southern.
You're being empathetic with me as an interviewer because you've given me a great segue to the next question, and that is about CISM, in particular, the critical incident stress management. You have been instrumental in this in the judiciary, and I know your efforts have been widely appreciated and praised. Could you give us a little bit of just a thumbnail sketch of what CISM is, how it originated, what it's based on, and how it's been working in the federal courts?
Okay. Let me emphasize first off, CISM, Critical Incident Stress Management, is a multi-component, comprehensive crisis intervention model. And it really does have a home in the arena, the much larger arena of crisis intervention, which again goes back to as far back as World War I and World War II, where they realized back then, even bringing soldiers off the battlefield who were not necessarily physically injured but were psychologically perhaps injured based on what they experienced in the battlefield, and that early interventions with these soldiers perhaps enabled them to at least get back to a baseline of operation of behavior so that they could re-engage with the troops or whatever the purpose would happen to be. Moving a little bit forward on the timeline, remember, you and I are old enough to remember the suicide hotlines that came into fruition. I think it was back in the 60s and perhaps even late 50s that, again, this whole notion of early intervention, getting people early on, trained peers, trained civilians, so to speak, not necessarily just flat-out mental health people on the other lines. They found out that one of the first times where you could use peers and train them to do this type of intervention, and found it to be very effective. So we really do, CISM really does have its home in that history, and it is a process that has evolved over time. Many people are familiar nowadays with hearing the phrase a critical incident stress debriefing, and I'm always quick to sort of correct that in terms of the debriefing is one intervention under the CISM umbrella that we use. It's the most notorious, the one that people, like I said, pretty much recall, but it is one intervention of many interventions that we would, again, tailor a response to. And I just want to emphasize, too, that CISM is one crisis intervention model among others out there. It just happens to be the one that I've had the experience in, and we've had, the courts request training in.
And so I know you were requested, for example, to go to New York after 9/11. Could you talk a little bit about that experience?
Sure. Shortly after 9/11, I had been, I had done some training. Well, let me go back even before 9/11. I had done some training with several of the courts in New York, Eastern District and Southern District, and this has been primarily probation and pretrial services, and New Jersey, and done some other training in some of the other offices around the country, and helped them at their request form CISM teams, and went in and did the 2 or 3 or 4 day training, whatever was requested. When 9/11 happened, I got a call from the team coordinator up there, Chris Porter, and requesting, if I could come up and assist with the intervention. At the time, as fate would have it, I had been planning to do the CISM training with New York Western, who had requested back in the summer. So I had to go up. I went out to New York Western to do that, but Chris also was in contact with the CISM team from the Northern District of New York, Paul DeFelice's group up there, and he was able to coordinate a response from their team more quickly, which was, again, early intervention, very beneficial. So those folks came down, and I think they spent the better part of a week right up front, immediately afterwards. And then I got a second call from Chris, because I had been talking to him off and on, and said that then the circuit executive, Karen Milton, had also requested. So I coordinated another group of response teams to come in the second week, and we spent the better part of 3 days there providing interventions for, I'd say, roughly 100 to 120 of their staff.
Wow. And you did these group briefings, you say?
We did briefings. We determined, and for an incident such as 9/11, the critical incident stress debriefing was, for the most part, an appropriate intervention to use. So we set up a series of debriefings over 3 days.
Terrific.
Yeah.
I'm sure that was very helpful. Mark, people watching the show, what would you advise them in terms of preparing for these kinds of catastrophes, crises, whatever we want to call them?
Let me answer that question, Michael, in the context of any traumatic event. You're going to have a panel come on later, and I know two of the three panelists are going to be talking about incidents, on a different level. I'm not going to say lesser, but just a different level, but nevertheless, traumatic and had a strong impact for them and other people, on their staffs. So in terms of preparing, I think you heard several people in the video talk about, can you ever prepare yourself? And their kind of feeling is, no, you can't. The emotional impact, I said earlier, the intensity of an event will really determine in many respects your level of reaction as well as that personal meeting. So there's going to be a reaction for which you probably can't prepare. But on the same line, doing what we call in CISM vernacular pre-incident education, getting people informed and educated up front about the nature of a response, how we respond to trauma. Stress management. I mean, lots of people have had stress management training, but I often wonder how many people truly practice the techniques that they are taught. Very beneficial. It positions you well. If you do all those good things up front, and I'm not just talking about the diet and exercise and everything else, but good support mechanisms, good family networks, good working relationships at the office, supporting one another. When you have those in place, if you have a strong faith, a wonderful resource, having those in place up front prior to something happening really positions you well in terms of being able to get through what you have to get through. It doesn't necessarily make it any less painful, any less traumatic in some respects, or any more difficult, but it gives you the options and the coping resources to pull upon that you're going to need to pull upon to get through what you need to get through.
And the old idea of toughing it out.
There are tough people that get through it, that call on these resources. But I think what you're referring to certainly is the toughing it out, the historical meaning of that, meaning just, take it all in, absorb it, and don't let your emotions show. Can be, I'm not saying always will be, but real potential to be damaging over the long term for an individual or for an organization. So you want to be mindful. It's tough to go through, but you want to allow people the opportunity, and again, the people in the video said it well, to get through it and get that early intervention, early.
Yeah, it was really, to me, it was very touching and powerful when I think it was Misty Lathan said that she felt much better when she stood up and admitted she was having trouble sleeping, and other people said
it's one of the things we do in CISM. We try to normalize people's reactions, and one of the ways we do that is a group process. And again, I couldn't have said any better. The minute somebody else said, I don't know about anybody else, but I'm having difficulty sleeping, or I'm scared at night, and boom, right away she had a connection. That's what CISM is about. I know the phrase on the video has been used at counseling sessions, but CISM, we're very quick to point out, is not counseling. It's not psychotherapy. Right. It's a group intervention process. It's a psychological and an educational process designed as an early intervention to help educate people and get them through something so that they know that what they're going through is normal, that their reactions are normal, that it's the event that's abnormal, and that it is shared. You saw the relief when, once I knew somebody else is going through the same thing, it's like, it's not me. It's not just me.
Yes.
And it's a tremendous resource to draw upon during the healing process.
Thanks. Those great insights. Really appreciate it. I'm going to go now out to our Push to Talk sites. We've had the pleasure of hearing from Dr. Maggio, from Mark. He's given us some great things to think about in addition to the material we saw at the Open. Let's see if there are any questions out at the Court of International Trade or in San Diego or the other Push to Talk sites that are up. Okay, let me also encourage you to use the fax questions, fax mode to send in questions. And since there are no questions at this point, think about them later for the panel.
Michael?
Yes.
Michael, this is Gene Caraway with the Circuit Court of Appeals in Atlanta.
Hi, Gene.
Let me turn my microphone off.
No, just turn your set down a bit.
Listen, I was wondering if there are any suggestions in terms of handling the avalanche of information that comes in the wake of some of these traumatic events. We're always sort of pulled to watch the news and that type of thing, but on the other hand, there's a lot of rumor and speculation and just misinformation that accompanies these things. And, that can just exaggerate the feelings that people are going through. So are there any recommendations on how to handle that?
That's a very good question. Let me take a stab at it, and then I'm going to turn it over to Mark. I think that is an excellent point, and there's a lot of information, and as you mentioned, some of it is conflicting. I think what's important is to get the accurate information you can get as quickly as you can get it, and limit yourself as far as dissemination to the things you know to be accurate if you're in a position of being one who disseminates information. It's better, I know people are very hungry for information at this point in time, but it's better to give less, in my opinion, but have that be accurate than it is to give a whole bunch, half of which may not be true. I think it's also important to develop over time confidence in certain sources of information. Somebody was telling me recently that they have developed a great deal of confidence, for example, in the Centers for Disease Control, just as a source of information on biological issues. So I think the more you develop this database in your own mind of who's really reliable and who isn't, that may be of aid. Mark?
You've hit upon a key point in terms of dealing with traumatic events. Information can be an antidote in a chaotic situation. And one of the things that we do in CISM is we try and equalize, as we say, the information cells. We learn early on up front what some of the rumors and what some of the other types of things that have been floating around before we even get into an intervention. I do a lot of intelligence gathering. If I'm the initial contact person called up prior to responding to an event, I do a lot of intelligence gathering up front to find out exactly as much as I can about, really separating, fact from fiction, so to speak. The other thing I would suggest too, and going back to this pre-incident education notion that I mentioned earlier, is it helps for people early on to keep in their mind, and you do this in a teaching atmosphere, that at a time of chaos, there will be rumors and there will be information that's unsubstantiated, but that people will start latching onto. There's immediate need, and as part of this is really understanding how we respond to crisis. There's an immediate need to understand why something happened, how this could have, and we saw it in the response to the judge. The judge immediately was trying to come up with some sort of, must have been a gas explosion. Okay, we're trying to make sense out of it. So understanding up front, helping people understand up front how we tend to respond at times of crisis will help them, I think, really sort of develop an individual plan or pattern for how to deal with the information that comes in so quickly in the aftermath. I can add, when we were here in the building in D.C. on September 11th, and we were staying out on our observation deck watching the plume of smoke coming from the Pentagon, and within that first hour, the rumor of the, I think it was a car bombing at the State Department, and one other explosion on the mall, both of which turned out to be false. But within that first hour, there were stories flying. So keeping in mind that, go with initial reports that you get. But I'm a very big believer in the issue of the pre-incident education and discussing how people tend to react in crisis and why we look for that information and are willing to accept anything in the absence of what actually occurred. I hope that helps.
Thanks, Mark, and thanks for your question. In the meantime, we've received one fax question, and we're going to take this one now, and then we're going to go to our break. And the question has come in from the Pecos Division, United States Probation, Western District of Texas. Thank you very much. What types of programs have court families instituted to prepare themselves in the event of a crisis? We've already talked about the CISM program that Mark is involved in. Mark, can you think of other things that the courts have done? I know of, and again, I'll have to refer to primarily probation and pretrial, as those have
have been the primary recipients rather of the CISM training we've done. A lot of folks are, aside from forming the CISM teams, have formed critical incident response policies, and part of that gets into just in the event of something traumatic happening just to an officer, having a protocol in place, policy and protocol in place to handle public information, how to disseminate information to staff, coordinating liaison with the family, having those plans in place up front, you know, are very beneficial and really complement in many respects what we do in CISM. Those are the ones, other than the actual CISM team formations, that I'm aware of. And I do know some folks in Western District of Texas who've had the CISM training. And as I mentioned to Michael earlier, there are teams, primarily the ones I'm focused on are the ones on the East Coast, but there's also Michigan Eastern, Texas Northern Pretrial, I believe, like I said, Texas Western, I believe Texas Eastern, and forgive me, I'll be forgetting a couple of districts out there, but there are other teams there.
You'll hear from them, I'm sure.
I'm sure I will. I'm sure I will.
Thank you. Let me just mention a few other resources that you should be aware of. One is, of course, the occupant emergency plans that the AO has disseminated to the courts, which your court should be involved in, and of course also the continuity of operations plans, the COOPs, that Bill Lehman and others have talked to us quite a bit about and that are available. I should also mention that the center has, of course, its media library with lots of materials that relate to this area, if not directly, at least indirectly, and you have in your participant handouts today a list of resources that you could consult. So thanks a lot for the question. We're going to, at this point, take a 5-minute break. We thank Dr. Maggio for his wonderful comments, and we will look forward to picking up with the panel 5 minutes from now. Have a nice break. See you in 5. Welcome back. We're joined now by three members of the court family that can help us further reflect upon the issue of confronting crisis. I'm pleased to introduce first Mr. Bob Dennis, the clerk of the U.S. District Court, Western District of Oklahoma, who you've already heard quite a bit about and who will elaborate a little bit more about his experiences with the Murrah bombing. Elaine Terenzi is the Chief Probation Officer, Middle District of Florida, who had to deal with the incident of a murder of a probation officer while she was still in Brooklyn, New York. And Kathleen Slevin, who is a U.S. probation officer in the Eastern District of New York, who was first to respond to a terrible incident in the Long Island Railroad in 1993, known as the Colin Ferguson incident. Elaine, would you elaborate a little bit on what you faced in that situation?
We as an office in April of 1993, on a very quiet Friday afternoon, one of our probation officers, Danielle Almanor, had come into work that day and had left the office to attend a family court hearing. She was in a dispute with her husband, who had been quite controlling over months previous to the incident. And when she went for the family court, into the family court building for the hearing, while she was waiting for the hearing, her husband came in. He was a New York State parole officer, and he pulled out a service revolver. He shot and killed her and shot a woman sitting next to her, who he later said he believed to be one of our staff members. The first word that we received was from the homicide detective who called us to do the notification. Because it was literally across the street from the office, and it was in the family court building where people go to be protected from domestic violence incidents. It was a very dramatic response. There was a lot of ambulances, police cars, in their neighborhood of the office.
And then the office had to act to respond.
Initially, the first part was to try and just figure out what had happened, and our initial concern was for her 13-year-old daughter, who had just in this one fast incident lost both her mother and really also her father, and to try and locate her so that she could be told compassionately.
Yes, wow, it's been really tough. Bob, your experiences in Oklahoma City.
Michael, it was April the 19th, 1995, as you've seen in the video, and it was a beautiful spring day, as I remember, and I had a meeting that morning with the GSA, General Services Administration, building manager and his staff. We were going to discuss several projects that we had ongoing at the time with the courts, and so I walked over there. The meeting started at 8 o'clock. We have an underground tunnel that goes underneath the Murrah parking garage that connects the two buildings. So I went over for the meeting. The meeting terminated just a few minutes before 9 o'clock, and the building manager had some business back in the federal courthouse building, so he was walking with me back over to the courthouse building, and we were walking along the first floor. The meeting was on the first floor of the Murrah building, and we walked to the center of the building where the elevators were located, and somewhere, I'm not sure exactly where it was, but we were together, and that's when the bomb went off, and just remember the loud explosion and just the hearing the sounds of debris and things falling. Of course, had no idea what was going on around me. It was totally pitch dark at that just in a split second. Everything just went totally black. And although the building manager and I were standing next to each other immediately after the explosion, I was having trouble breathing. Well, we all were. We was coughing and could hardly gasping for air because there wasn't enough air. It was almost like you were drowning, but managed to yell, and Don was yelling back. We couldn't see each other. You couldn't see your hand in front of your face, but remember, to get to Don, I had to climb over and around debris and scrambling over stuff, and we finally found each other, and we held hands, actually, and just sort of felt our way out at that point, and thought we were going to go out the front door, but of course didn't realize what had happened, and we ended up coming out the west end of the building, and immediately when I got out, I ran back to the courthouse building to check on the employees and court personnel, and remember running to the center of the building, the main entrance, and making sure that the building was evacuated and people were out safely.
Right. Very courageous action on your part. Kathleen, you also acted courageously.
So I'm told. On December 6th, 1993, I was a passenger on the 533 train from Manhattan to Westbury, New York. At the time, I worked for the New York City Department of Probation, and I was a volunteer emergency medical technician. During the course of the train ride, 2 stops prior to completing my train stop, passengers came running into the car, screaming that other passengers had been shot. The train finally came to a halt, and a conductor told us to exit the train. Upon exiting the train, I asked a police officer if they needed assistance, as I was a volunteer EMT, and he literally picked me up and put me into the railroad car where all of the shooting had taken place. As it turns out, 23 of my fellow passengers were shot. It was very frustrating to be the first emergency medical technician on site with no supplies, and it was necessary to perform triage and try and help those and save those who I could, and decide who I would be unable to save. It was very difficult playing God.
Yes, I bet. These are all very compelling descriptions. I want to go back to a subject that I visited briefly with Mark, and that was involved in some of the earlier tapes, that people go through a series of steps in reacting to a crisis. Their first step is shock and disbelief, and then anger, and then a renewed sense of competence and focus. Did you experience this yourselves or observe it in others as you went? Bob?
Yeah, I can still remember when I came out of the Murrah building on the West End, and I turned around and I looked and saw the front of the building that had been blown away. It's sort of a surreal feeling, and it seemed like there for a moment the world just kind of stood still. There's just sort of an unreal feeling about it, and it just seemed like the world had just stopped turning at that given moment, because you just total disbelief. Thought, well, it's a bad dream. You're going to wake up any minute and something, the reality would be there. But it was a very shocking and certainly a very dismaying thing to look at. And yeah, I went through a lot of shock, and I ran back to the courthouse building and saw a lot of other court personnel was on the street, and of course they were commenting the way I looked, and they too were also in shock. And people have told me that they've said certain things to me that I don't remember anything about, because I'm sure that probably I was in a great deal of shock, but other people too. I think the shock lingered for days. I think people were still stunned and shocked, just couldn't assemble as to what really happened, and it took months, I think, before you really got over that initial stage that this really did happen, that people could be so cruel as to do something like this. I certainly think that months later, some of the initial hearings of the defendants who were brought into the courthouse, and as you heard on the tape earlier about the mixture of victims' families and then the families of the accused mixing together and bringing the people, the perpetrators, back into the courthouse. A great deal of anger, of course, people still feeling the aftermaths of those, the daycare center and the children that were killed, and seeing the perpetrators, people, it just seemed like a senseless act, needless, unnecessary, but I think there was a great deal of anger there. Yes. And I think eventually that a lot of people finally got past the anger stage and got to kind of a resolve to go on with life. You just have to. You can't let it just completely control you.
That's right.
So.
Thanks. Elaine, did you notice a similar?
Well, our situation was very different from the situation that Bob went through. Initially, from the first moment that the telephone rang and the homicide detector called, things seemed to go very quickly. I mean, the phone was ringing off the hook. It seemed like there was so much to do. But I very vividly recall notifying staff and standing and looking at the room and seeing their stunned faces, because many of the people had seen her that morning. And some of them had even offered to go with her over to family court for support. She said, no, I'm fine, I'll go. So I can recall very clearly their faces.
Mm-hmm. I'm sure that'll stay with you for a long time. Kathleen, do you remember any similar syndrome of feelings, sequence of feelings?
I sure do. For the first 1 to 2 months after the incident, I had a very numbing sensation, almost like a surreal memory of the incident. It was a very well-publicized incident on the East Coast, and I no longer had the same identity that I had prior to the incident. People where I worked at the time, Manhattan Criminal Court, no longer referred to me as Kathleen. It was, oh, there's the hero from the train, which was very confusing to me, as I had feelings of guilt, helplessness, hopelessness for not being able to do all that I could have done. It was a very difficult time for me, and the time lasted because I really didn't research anything or provide myself with a forum to discuss anything, so I kind of kept everything bottled in until like a year later I had survivor's guilt, you know, that could have been me that was shot. But it took a long time to get over that.
I bet it did. Thanks for sharing that with us. You've all talked about a need to act in a very difficult situation, but really not knowing exactly what to do. I guess my question is, so what resources can you draw on in a difficult time like this? Elaine?
Well, that day was actually the first day as a new deputy chief that I was in charge of the office, so we didn't expect anything to happen. It was such a quiet day. And so very quickly had to put together a plan and figure out what to do. And I took, after the first few phone calls, I took about a 6-minute break, and I called Mark Maggio. I knew Mark, I'd worked with him, and I knew that he had special expertise in this area. And I said, Mark, I don't want to get this wrong. Well, help me out here. Give me some pointers. And he did. He almost like the terrific coach that he is, very bulleted kinds of things. Inform people in person. Give them as much information as possible. People will need information to help make sense out of this. Some people are going to want to go home. Make sure that you let them know that it's okay for them to go home. Other people may not want to leave, so be prepared to stay late. It was almost very, very quick bulleted kinds of things, and there are several articles out there, one of which Mark and I wrote together later that outlines some of those things. I found that very, very helpful. Also, we had help from some other court units. Her family, Danielle's family, were from France. They were not in the United States at the time. So we had to do the notification to the family in France, which was very, very difficult. And also, we relied on our court interpreters that came in, and they helped us with that. We allowed EAP and had EAP available for people who needed it, but I think that most of our staff found the most amount of comfort talking with one another, and once Danielle's family came in, talking with Danielle's family with the interpreters in a group, that was probably the most helpful for us.
Yeah, that's good that you were able to regain a sense of presence of mind to even think about interpreters.
It became very obvious very quickly that we needed interpreters.
Yeah. Yes.
And that worked out well. Also, we received a tremendous amount of support from all over the country. One of the officers had written one of her good friends had written a lovely eulogy and put it in News and Views. And we opened an education fund for her daughter, and we received donations from all over the country, quite a bit of money. And so we were able to provide some real tangible support, and I think that helped us all, made us all feel good about what we were doing, at least in response to this tragedy.
Yes, good. Bob, what kind of resources were you able to draw on?
I think first and foremost, probably the dedication and the spirit of the court personnel. They were extremely cooperative and courageous, of coming to work and doing the things they did. And I think they showed a great deal of compassion for one another. When people did come back to the court, it was like one big family, and everyone just really got along very well and did a great job. And One of the major resources that we had was the other court units. I think it was mentioned earlier that, well, is in the tape. The Oklahoma courts of the Eastern District and the Northern District and Kansas and Northern Texas also came in to help, and that was a big help and a great resource to us. The other court units in Oklahoma, even the probation pretrial services and the bankruptcy court and federal defender, we all worked together and cooperated together to do common things with our employees to try to solve the situation and make people as comfortable as we possibly could. And you know, the whole thing was affected, not only the district court but also the post office building, which houses bankruptcy and pretrial and probation and federal defender, were all connected. All these buildings and the Murrah building were all connected, so everybody knew a lot of people that were killed and injured in the blast from not only the district court but also these other court units. And I remember too, the administrative office sent people down. They sent a team of people down, and they arrived within a couple of days. So we had they assisted us if we needed anything at all. They were make a phone call back to Washington, and we got the money, or we got the authorization to do some things, and so we got quick access to the administrative office. The circuit executive's office also was a great resource. They sent the circuit executive and then a team of his people came down. They provide us with excellent services. So, and plus, of course, we mentioned earlier is the EAP and counseling that was available to people immediately. That very weekend that we had the big gathering of all the court family, the counselors were available at that, and plus the following weeks they were available to counsel and to help people.
Terrific. Sounds like a great system of support, which is very important. Kathleen, I think you were able to draw on CISM. You've been involved in CISM, is that right?
I have. I've been one of the founding members of our critical incident response team for Eastern District of New York, which we were trained by Mark Maggio. I think it's very important for anyone who's either the witness or a victim of a traumatic event that they be provided with a forum for where they can describe their feelings in a safe environment and not feel like so alone. It's important for them to realize that others around them are probably going through the same feelings and anxieties. So I also believe that the earlier the intervention, the less damage and preventive measures are taken to prevent, further scarring of them. So it's very important.
Well put. I like your idea of not feeling alone. And your last comment about early leads me directly to a fax question that we've just gotten, and it's for Elaine, so I'm going to go ahead and ask it. And it comes from the Eastern District of Virginia in Norfolk, and it is, what type of crisis intervention was offered for staff members and fellow probation officers, and how soon after the incident?
In our incident in New York, we didn't feel that we considered it, but we didn't feel that a crisis intervention team was really the appropriate level of response for what we were feeling, which was mostly, shock and grief. We did make EAP available to those who wanted it, but it seemed that what was most helpful, we had some it was almost like debriefing in that it was very formal discussions. And it was somewhat more structured than you would have normally, just people talking, because, again, her family was from France. We did need the interpreter, so we brought together a group of Danielle's closest friends and colleagues, and had a discussion, like a kind of almost like a formal discussion, and that was just very helpful.
Very good. Another resource that you've all really alluded to or said directly is the cooperation and assistance of the court staff in restoring court operations and helping colleagues and so forth. I want to just now go ahead and play another segment from the interview with former Chief Judge Russell that underlines again this tremendous capability in the court to rely on its own staff.
It was just a tremendous undertaking to get this court going again. And it's just hundreds of thousands of pounds of debris, and you walk in the court, and it was you could hardly see for days. It was still so much dust and so forth in the air. And in spite of all that, on Monday morning we had people down here manning their positions and accepting filings and going about their tasks. And I'd just walk around and visit with people, and as I mentioned earlier, every one of them had people close to them that were dead, and the hospitals are lost. For probably 10 days, there were still hopes of finding people alive in the debris of the Murrah building. Yet people down there doing their work and feeling obligated, the vast majority shouldered their responsibility and did things that I would not expect of them.
Judge Russell is referring again to this tremendous capacity of people to do more than is expected of them in a crisis situation, to step forward and offer skills and abilities that may have been even hidden in other contexts. Elaine, did you notice the same kind of syndrome in your situation?
What was the most heartening part of the tragedy was watching our staff respond. We had one woman went immediately, as soon as she heard, went to the hospital, even though we knew, and she knew, that Danielle had died. And when I asked her later, I said, why'd you do that? She said, because that's what I would have done if it had been my sister. We had, because her family was not here, and her closest kin was her husband who had done this, we stepped in really as family. And so we had people working on funeral arrangements. We did the identification at the morgue so that to save her daughter from that experience. Just all of the things that family would do, our staff stepped in and did. And it wasn't based on anybody, the supervisor or the manager. It was really based on people's individual experiences, their relationship with Danielle. They just stepped in. It was really quite heartwarming to watch.
Those are great examples of a demonstration of leadership in a non-hierarchical sense, and I think that's very compelling. Bob, did you notice any similar kinds of behaviors?
Yeah, Michael, we had, I think, many, many examples of leadership. I recall distinctly as I ran back to the courthouse when I got out of the Murrah building, I passed one of our judges who was assisting a juror on the curb the juror had been injured very severely by flying glass and was bleeding profusely. There was other employees also helping out. I passed judges who had been cut, bleeding, and also a couple employees that I sort of temporarily saw, but they were on their way over to the Murrah building to help with rescue efforts and to get people out of the building. And I remember one of the deputy clerks who was was working at an ambulance, and she was helping with injured people. And as a matter of fact, one of my deputy clerks that I work with, her son-in-law had been injured. He was injured in the blast. I think he was up in the credit union when the bomb went off, and he was slightly injured. And they were taking him to the hospital. And so anyway, I ended up being transported to the hospital by them. And then a family member eventually, one of her family members eventually took me home from the hospital. So there was just a multitude of courageous acts that people were doing in leadership. They just stepped in. And I remember a couple of automation people, that ladies were injured in the blast, and they were taken to the hospital, and one of them had a broken nose and lacerations, and they were both treated, and the next day they were back at the office helping out and worked through the weekend and to help try to restore things and get things back to normal. So I think for probably weeks and even months, people went the extraordinary miles to help out. Yeah. And I think showed great dedication and great courage.
I agree, and I like Elaine's use of the word heartening to describe these things. These comments really feed directly into our next video clip, which is going to feature Sherri Carter, the clerk of the district court in Los Angeles, who had to manage operations after a flood hit the office, and the clerk's office gathered together people from different parts of the organization. She'll speak of her admiration for the staff, and we'll also hear from the exhibits custodian, Tyrone Lawson, about his appreciation for the team effort.
I wanted to involve staff in the cleanup. I received some additive money to try to clean up the mess because it was a huge disaster in cleaning it up. Ceiling tiles scattered all over the system's furniture, and it was just a real problem. Rather than hiring people off the streets who really don't understand court operations, we developed an employee recognition program where people could volunteer to work weekends, and we would clean up the project together.
It was a feeling of satisfaction because normally the record section of a works within itself. You know, we normally don't have any of the other parts of the court, of other departments of the court work with us. And during that time, everybody in the court, from the CRDs to the docket clerks to intake to procurement, I believe we had some people from jury, they all volunteered their time to help us out here down in exhibits to get everything taken care of.
They were given cash awards, which are allowable under the Employee Recognition Awards program. I really did not expect over 60 employees to volunteer to work weekends. And we're talking not just 2-day weekends, but 3-day weekends where they would come in every day to work together. We had people work every weekend for 4 months. And in our Employee Recognition Awards ceremony, we took a picture of a majority of the employees who were present with the chief judge and myself and my incoming chief judge. It was really a positive experience because we had courtroom deputies working with docket clerks, working with records clerks, working with procurement clerks, really on a team project, and it was really a wonderful experience to see them work together.
Well, now we're back, and I'm aware that we have advertised an end time of 2:30 for this program. We may go on a few minutes later, but I want to take this opportunity to see if any of the push-to-talk sites who may have planned to leave at 2:30 want to ask any questions of our panelists or of Mark Maggio or me, for that matter, at this point. Atlanta is off the hook since they've already asked the question. So let me ask if the Court of International Trade or the court in San Diego or perhaps the court in Norfolk, Virginia has any questions.
Yes, San Diego does have a question.
Great. Go right ahead.
This is for Kathleen. How did you go about starting the CISM panel in your district?
The best thing to do is to contact Mark Maggio, as he is the trainer for, I believe, the administrative office and the FJC. He provides a wonderful training session which lasts a couple of days. I would suggest that you speak to your chief officer to find out if they would be open to such an idea, which I believe they would, and definitely contact Mark Maggio.
And that's the last time we're allowed to mention Mark's name today. Thank you for your question. Any other questions? Okay, well, we're going to go now to a next question about what we've all learned from our experiences. And these are very tough situations to talk about, but again, we're going to hear from a few staff about recovering emotionally and psychologically from a trauma. We're going to hear from Misty Lathan again, whom we've heard from before, and from Stacy Nafee, who have some very interesting comments to share, and I'd like you to hear from them before we proceed.
I think I would try to be a little bit more in tune to the employees. If they were having a bad day, let them stay home. You know, just keep them home if they're having a bad day. I think eventually you get to a point where you have to say, it's time. You know, we've got to do this as a court, and it's time for us to do it. But I think there's also, I think, a period of time that you have to struggle with on when is it okay. I don't think there's really any answer to that one.
Take your time. Don't expect 5 days later, 5 months later, that all is going to be well with you. It's not. I mean, we're not designed that way. We're not hooked up that way. You have to give yourself time. And you have to let yourself feel every emotion you feel. It's okay to have a bad day. It's okay to have 2 bad days, to have a whole lot of bad days in a row, because you do.
Kathleen, bad days?
Bad days turn into bad weeks sometimes. I think it's very important that a victim or a witness to a traumatic event be allowed to acknowledge their feelings, be given a forum for them to speak about what they're feeling, to let them know that they're not alone. When you go through a traumatic experience, you're no longer the person you were the day prior to the traumatic experience. It's very important to incorporate all that you feel into the new person you become after the experience.
That's a good way of putting it. Bob?
Michael, one thing I learned after the Oklahoma City bombing, you've got to have a great deal of compassion and also an understanding that no two people are exactly alike, that there are differences among people, and people react to very traumatic situations differently. They have different reactions to it. Some of them will get over it very quickly. Some of them will take many, many years perhaps to get over it. And it's not getting over it, it's just a matter of reacting to it differently. I remember some comments from people who had stayed home for a while, and then when they came to work, they said felt much better to be among people that shared the common tragedy together, where they could talk to and be a part of the office, rather than sitting home watching TV, being alone. That's not for some people, that's not a good thing for them to deal with, and so they felt much more comfortable when they came back to work. One thing, too, is one of the churches across the street had built a chapel, and during the recovery process and trying to recover bodies and so forth from the Murrah building, they built a little chapel, and a lot of people would go over during the workday, and some of them just needed to go over by themselves just for a few moments of contemplation, prayer, thought. Some of them needed to go over maybe as a group, 2 or 3 at a time, might go over together, and just for kind of a special time of being together and sharing their emotions and so forth. And I think those were important things, and that's some of the things that I learned.
Thank you. Elaine, did you have comments in that regard?
Well, I couldn't agree more strongly with Bob about being sensitive to different people's reactions to things. Different people process things differently, and we all carry into the situation different life experiences as well. On the day that Danielle died, we had folks who left and needed to go home to be with their families. We had folks who just wanted to be by themselves, and we had folks who wanted to be with their colleagues and found it difficult to leave the office. I also think that it does help to provide as much information as quickly as you can, accurate information. I think that the details also help to try, as Mark had said earlier, to make sense of what is at times a very senseless situation, and having systems in place to get information out. I also, from that, believe that it is helpful if people hear information from a person directly rather than from radio or television or some other means. And you may not, as a manager, be able to get to everybody personally, but have systems in place so that you let folks know and orchestrate, like, you're going to tell these folks, we're going to tell these folks. Also, I think that it's helpful, especially for folks that seem to work with the judiciary, to be active and to get involved and to create opportunities for people to get involved, particularly those people who might be closest to the situation. So those are the things that I've found to be helpful.
I really like your point about the personal touch and communication. I think at times like this it's absolutely vital, and I really appreciate that advice.
I think that it conveys dignity, a message of dignity, and I think that that's very important.
Thank you. Well, we're going to move now into our final section here, and this section has to do with us offering advice, or you offering advice to our audience. And the question is, as I asked Mark Maggio before, whoops, I just violated my own rule, but as I asked the good doctor before, about advice he would recommend. I'm going to also ask you about advice you would recommend for people watching this show who want to prepare themselves adequately for the future, which at the very least is an uncertain future. What would you advise people to do? Elaine?
Well, from this experience and from, unfortunately, a couple of other experiences within the court, I really have two things that are near and dear to my heart. One is the emergency notification forms. I know that staff don't like to do them. They don't like the idea of putting personal information down, in a form about, who to contact or what have you. But I look at those forms as this provides an opportunity for your friends and your colleagues, and God forbid there is a tragedy or an awful situation. This gives them what they need to help you and your family. I think that those are very important. It's also important to have them available, not just in a file in